Hello, global gardeners. It's a chilly Monday for many of us. I've seen how many of you are sharing how cold you are. It is a cold day for Francis in British Columbia. Most of the United States and Canada are actually experiencing a pretty cold day. I want to give a shout out to everyone who's joining us today from all over the world. Christine Ruddy is in the UK. We have Jean-Pierre, of course, joining us in the evening in Belgium. And Earthly Spaces, of course, it's evening time in the Netherlands as well. And it's so nice to have you all here. And most of the states, I think, in the United States tend to be represented on Mondays by the time we all get together. So let's talk some gardening as we share what's happening with us all around the world. Today we're going to try to do a focus on organic gardening and what that really means, at least to me and to you, because my guess is that the definition might be a little bit different depending on how you garden and where you garden. And Catherine is gardening in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and has a question. Would be interested in hearing about plants easily grown in a small greenhouse. And so this is a good question. When we talk about greenhouse growing and the type of plants that we're going to be growing in greenhouses, much depends on where you are, how thick or effective the insulation is on your greenhouse, what it is you want to grow, and if you're doing any supplemental heating and lighting. In my Colorado 5B garden, it's already much too cold. My greenhouse has gotten well below freezing because I don't have any additional heat in it. What I have in my greenhouse right now that's actively growing is nothing. But I do have a couple fig trees that I planted, fig trees that are hardy down to zone 5. It's a Chicago fig tree. I put them in my greenhouse for a little bit extra protection. So when you say small, it depends. I have a relatively small greenhouse. It's 3 meters wide by 4 meters long. And I will prune and train those fig trees as they grow to fit in that greenhouse. I like to point out often just how much I like the In the Garden with Eli and Kate channel. They have a greenhouse that's even smaller than mine, and on their channel they show regularly the beautiful peppers and tomatoes that they grow in their greenhouse. Now they're in Scotland, so their winters aren't as cold as mine, maybe a little more comparable to Tennessee, though I think Tennessee probably gets a little bit colder. And so you have to match the greenhouse growing with the season, with the plants for your particular area. I think possibly for Tennessee that you could grow a lot of tender herbs in the greenhouse well into the winter and even get an early start in spring. So this is one of those jobs of analysis to do over the winter to figure out what it is you want to grow, why you have a greenhouse, and to see if you can match what you want to grow with your greenhouse. And often you can. Now, I have my greenhouse so that I can grow peppers and tomatoes earlier in the season and later in the season. But I recognize that I can't grow them over the winter. So a greenhouse is not automatically a ticket for 4-season gardening for you. And actually, that just jogged my memory. Go ahead and check out the book 4-Season Gardening. I think it might be on my list of favorite books that I have in the link below in the description, where he talks about growing in a greenhouse and choosing the types of plants that you can grow in the winter, the kind of plants that can handle cold temperatures, and that little bit extra protection in the greenhouse might be enough to give them the extra boost that they need to be successful. So a couple ideas, hopefully that helps. It really comes down to what you want to grow and whether you're going to be providing any extra heat. If you've got a heater and lights in your greenhouse, you can grow just about anything almost year round. So a lot of it depends on how much effort you have and whether you have all that supplemental that the plants need. So, okay, let's see. Gardens Happen says, I don't tend to worry about organic gardening. I tend to trend toward organic gardening organically. Okay, I can see a little bit of a groan there, but it does raise an interesting point. And that's what I wanted to start with today. What does organic gardening mean? And is it gardening organically? And that's kind of the way I look at it. When we talk about organic produce that we buy at the store, or we look at that or that certified organic sticker that is on all kind of products, those come from organic growers who are certified by the government because of the types of practices that they're using in their growing. The one that most of us are aware of is the synthetic chemicals that are used in a lot of industrial agriculture. They're not used in organic gardening. But you can still use a lot of hazardous chemicals as far as pesticides and herbicides and still be certified as an organic farmer. You just have to use the chemicals that are on the approved organic list. So many of us, when we are gardening and think of ourselves as an organic gardener, we might draw some correlations to the certified organic farmers. There's no definition of what makes an organic gardener. There's no certifications for organic gardening. So it really comes down to how you choose to garden. And I choose to garden organically. Now, to me, that means no synthetic chemicals. It also means that I try to work with nature and I allow insects into my garden and I even allow weeds into my garden. That's a method for me that promotes the philosophy of organic gardening as I see it. But you could easily be an organic gardener, go to the store and buy one of those herbicides or pesticides or fertilizers that are labeled organic and use them in your garden to keep the insects out or to keep the weeds out. And I think you can still consider yourself to be an organic gardener. So we'll intersperse this. I'm looking forward to seeing your comments as well if you think you're an organic gardener or that you are gardening organically. Because as we all evolve as gardeners, I think this is a direction that many of us are headed. We're trying to get away from the synthetic chemicals and we're trying to work closer with nature. I think if you fight nature, it's going to be a losing battle every time. So if you can learn to create that balance in your garden, and one of the ways to do that is to garden organically. If you can do that, then the soil tends to be healthier, your plants tend to be healthier, and I tend to enjoy myself. One of the things I don't like doing is spraying bugs and spraying plants and putting all those chemicals on. So when I don't do that, it makes me feel better. It's one of those things that I don't often consciously think about how good I feel because I'm not doing something. But when that thought arises, because there's a pest in the garden, when I look at that pest, I know what the pest is, I know how to handle the pest, and I have a conscious thought of, I'm not going to use a chemical on this pest. That's organic gardening to me. That's one of those methods that we can use to help us down that particular plant. Rick is saying buying in compost can be a nightmare for organic gardeners. And that's a good point. And so using compost is a great way to garden organically because you're building the soil, you're using the compost to improve the soil rather than adding a fertilizer. And you can add organic fertilizers, but even by adding an organic fertilizer versus a synthetic fertilizer, you're still disrupting the soil life in the soil. Adding organic matter like a compost, I think, is a great way to improve the soil without having to add a fertilizer. But Rick's point is good. If you buy the compost, and we talked about this recently, last week or the week before, where we were talking about buying composts for your garden. If you don't know the source, then that material might not be organic. Your definition of organic. or my definition of organic. I'm trying to avoid those synthetic chemicals. And it's entirely possible that I buy compost and what was used to make that compost was treated with synthetic chemicals. Now, if I add that to my garden, where does that fit? Is it organic gardening or not? I like to think that gardening organically is a philosophy. So by using compost, I can still be gardening organically. Not knowing helps a little bit, I guess, but it's okay because it's the method of gardening I think is more important. And if every now and then something slips into the garden that is synthetic or that doesn't match my definition, I'm okay with that. That happens. Those things will occur. I can still follow the processes of using nature, of using the organic matter for my soil, of recognizing what the insect is to determine whether it's a pest or a beneficial insect, attracting the snakes and the frogs and the lizards and the birds and all of those other animals that will benefit my garden. That's a method of gardening organically. And that's one of the things that I really try to stress in my own area. But if you're serious about no chemicals and those other aspects that for you are important with organic gardening, then Rick's point is extremely valid. And you might not want to buy any product that you don't know the source of, if it could potentially be at odds with your opinion of organic gardening. Chris is wondering what my thoughts are on using neem oil. I have neem oil. I've used neem oil, and this is one of those organic alternatives that is a way to deal with certain pests, and it's not a synthetic chemical. It comes from the neem tree. And so if you use, in my opinion, if you use something that comes from a tree or a seed, and then you can use that in your garden as a substitute for something that is not natural and synthetic, I think it's a good option. The thing about neem oil is it only works on certain insects. It does tend to target the insects we see as pests, and doesn't necessarily harm most of the benefits that we see as beneficial, because depending on how you apply it, it either coats the outside of the insect or the insect will ingest it. And it's a weird chemical. When you look at neem oil, it just totally disrupts the internal organs of those particular insect pests. It's not immediate. It doesn't kill them right away. It might take days depending on the insect, but it can be a pretty effective method of insect control. But like most things that you would spray on a plant, it dissipates, washes off, and so it is something that you need to reapply from time to time. I've used neem oil on scale and on aphids with some pretty good effect. When I was growing indoors, I've actually used neem oil primarily as an indoor insect control rather than an outdoor. So this gets back to the basic philosophy. Neem oil, I think, fits within organic gardening. I don't use it outdoors because the way I garden outdoors is more of a let nature take care of it all. But indoors, where I don't have those beneficial insects and nature really isn't helping me out, that's when I resort to something like neem oil to help keep those insect pests under control. So Britt Lee says, love this topic. I garden with no chemicals, and so I can learn how to live with nature. There you go. And so at the Galileo Garden, the school garden that I ran a number of years ago, we used to like to say that we were beyond organic because we used 0 synthetic chemicals. When we used a fertilizer, it was a fertilizer that we made and then used on the plants, like the comfrey leaves that we would make into a fertilizer. We tried not to use fertilizer. It took some time, but over about 4 years, we no longer needed the fertilizer because we were regularly amending the soil. And so we had literally a ton of produce that we would harvest in a year and no chemicals of any type used on those. We did have some infestations of insects. We had the harlequin bug one year, was really bad. I just took a bunch of students and we spent an hour just picking off harlequin bugs, putting them into plastic bags and throwing the bags in the freezer so we could look at them after they had all died. That's organic gardening to me. No chemicals, but it's also getting you and whoever you're gardening with right there with nature and seeing how everything works together. So I think that's one of those kind of things that is a lot of fun. That's one reason why I like the organic gardening. Joe's Crayons, hello to you. I have some tulips growing in my garden and taking good care of them. Good for you. This was a year, I think I mentioned it a number of years back or a number of months back, but for me, this was the year without tulips. I have tulips in my landscape, but we had such a weird winter and spring, and we had frigid cold just as the tulips were starting to bloom, or starting to break ground, I should say, and that was enough to kill them off. So we had no tulips. I'm glad to hear you're having some good tulips. I'm hoping I have some tulips next year. Bud says, I've used neem oil effectively to manage powdery mildew on squash and pumpkins. Do you have any other solutions? One of the organic methods that we used on squash and pumpkins for powdery mildew was milk. And you may have seen this. I would have the kids bring the cartons of milk from the lunchroom, and we would dilute it. I think it's about a 9-to-1, basically a 10% milk solution. And spraying that on the leaves does have some effect. And I've read some studies that that milk spray can actually help with the powdery mildew problem. So that's one of the things that we did as far as a spray once the powdery mildew had shown up. But the advice that I always give, it's all about air circulation. One of the things that really leads to powdery mildew being a problem is that the leaves, there's too many leaves, they're growing too close together, there's no air circulation, and that environment of dry, not wet, dry, still air is actually what the powdery mildew spores are looking for. If you can have the wind blowing over your leaves, you're less likely to have powdery mildew. So some selective pruning to try to make sure you've got the leaves that aren't just growing on top of each other can help out. And that's the approach I tend to take. And so, for instance, this year, I did that with my pumpkins, and I had no issues with powdery mildew on my pumpkins because they were wide open, had lots of space. My yellow squash in particular, I got lazy. The plants were doing great. They grew, ton of leaves, and I had powdery mildew because there just wasn't any air circulation under the hoop where I had my yellow squash. So consider looking into a milk spray if you got powdery mildew, but also just giving the plants some air, and that might also reduce it. But, and you've probably heard me say this many times, powdery mildew is one of those diseases that we all get. And if you don't have it, you will get it. And just be aware of that. It's all around us. And you can take all kinds of control measures to keep it from coming to your garden, but those spores are in the air, blowing in the wind. And so unless you cover your plants to keep all of that off, the likelihood is that you're going to get powdery mildew at some time, potentially every single year. It's not a devastating disease, but it is one of those that we can live with, I think, without too much issue. And so sunset gazing has an idea with the milk as well, and it's the antifungal properties of the milk that makes it effective. And so you can douse fairy rings in your yard, which are usually a fungi that's growing, with the diluted milk as well. So thank you for that suggestion. That's one of those things that can help. Bohemian herbology. Garlic wash is definitely worth a look into powdery mildew as well. Oh, I haven't used that. Used it as a cure 2 years ago. Prevention this year. There you go. Aeration is the key. And so it's if you can keep powdery mildew away, that's great. If you can get it, a simple spray is often enough. Sometimes you can just cut off the first leaves that you see it on, and that's enough to keep it from spreading as well. So prevention is definitely a good idea, and that's a lot of the approach I like to take. Earthly Spaces, nice to see you, and evening to you. On my balcony, some bulbs are already sprouting. I think it's because of the crazy dry spring and a very hot summer. Most of nature is out of its normal rhythm. Yeah, that is entirely true. I've seen a lot of stuff sprouting and not sprouting as well. I haven't had my bulbs, but that's interesting that you're getting some bulbs sprouting at this time of year. And maybe that's what the tulip reference was earlier as well. It's just that it is crazy with the temperatures we're having today. And I'll talk more about this at the end. Today, my temperature here in Colorado, and for much of us in this part of the country, it's not going to get above freezing. Tomorrow, it's not going to get above freezing. On Wednesday, the high temperature is going to be just above freezing, and then it drops again. And right now, the forecast for my garden on Friday is 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The high is 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's -7 Celsius. So there's definitely some cold, and I was a bit concerned when I planted my garlic a few weeks back. It had been so warm, I was worried that my garlic was going to start sprouting if it stayed warm. Well, I don't have to worry about that anymore because the cold has set in with a vengeance. And the soil isn't frozen yet, but it's starting to get to that point. Mala brought in a tomato yesterday from the garden that I missed in my cleanup, and it was rock solid. It had already frozen solid. So I don't think I have to worry about anything sprouting. But for those of you that are still having those ups and downs and those very warm conditions, make note of that. And I've said this in recent weeks as well. Try to start identifying some of those trends that you might see with the weather patterns and what happens, like the bulbs might be sprouting. And next year, when you see some of those trends beginning to develop, you might be able, especially if you're growing in containers, to move your containers around to help mitigate some of those extremes that your plants are getting. Hello, Rachel. I found out what critter's been destroying my containers and hanging baskets. It's a squirrel, and he ate all the garlic. Well, I'm glad you found out. The thing about squirrels and most of those animal pests that is just a barrier. If you can keep your plants away from them with some type of barrier, that's a very effective method. And as I've said in many times in the past, particularly with squirrels, now that you know that that's the problem you have, you might be able to direct the squirrels elsewhere. Set up a squirrel feeder and keep them happy someplace else, and they're less likely to dig up your garden. So glad to hear that you identified it. Sorry to hear that you've had that issue with the squirrels. Two Gals says we've gone from 60s and 70s to 30s and below overnight. Crazy. Still need to put straw on the strawberries. Yeah, the thing about the strawberries, I have that issue every year. They can handle cold, and so they're green, they're growing. It looks like they're still sending out roots underground, which is why I like to keep them growing as long as possible. And then suddenly you realize you're behind and you should have mulched the area around the strawberries. So I'm glad you're aware of that, because that is one of those tasks that so many of us often forget to do until it's a little bit late. Hi, Bud. Burr is right. Lowest temp so far was one night at 26. Keep warm. I will. Thank you. I had the heater on in this room. It's a little loud, so I turned it off before I went live. But I've had the furnace turned up a little bit and had the room heater on, and I am definitely trying to stay warm. This is going to be one of those indoor weeks. I went out. So when we talk about cold temperatures, don't forget that you still need to water your plants, like the strawberries, for instance. The strawberries and most of the other plants in our gardens are still alive and still growing even when the temperatures drop that low. And so it's a very common response. The garden looks dead and we stop watering. You still need to water. My hose is frozen, and so I've got to get my 2-gallon watering can out, and that's what I did yesterday. Is I went out and I watered some of the most recent plants I put in, some of the flowers, perennial plants that I had grown, and I watered my strawberries, and I watered my blueberries and my columnar apple trees that are in pots. Yes, and my garlic that's in pots as well. I did that yesterday because yesterday was a fairly warm day. Now, the idea of winter watering is best done when the temperatures are above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, about 4.5 Celsius. If you water when it's freezing outside and the soil is frozen, you're wasting the water. It's not going anywhere. It might even freeze on the surface. When the temperatures are warmer and above freezing, and you have one of those warm days where it starts warm and stays warm, you're going to get some thawing, or particularly at this time of year, it's going to keep the soil from freezing. So get out there and continue watering so that you don't end up with dead plants. The roots have desiccated over the winter, and then in the spring you wonder why the plants aren't growing. Well, it might be the reason that they're not growing in spring is because you didn't water them in autumn or on those really warm days of winter. So keep up with the watering and hopefully things will be fine. Hassan, I was unable to germinate lettuce in the compost or potting mix containing compost. So I tested it with the alluvial soil and that worked like a charm. That's great. Alluvial soil, so you have alluvial fan is one of those geographic terms I remember learning in college. And that's where the rivers will flow down a mountain or through the hills, and it spreads out at the base. That's alluvial soil, and it tends to be richer because it's taken all the minerals and the nutrients from up on the mountain or up on the hillside, and it deposits in the low ground. That's why farmland that's down in the valley tends to be richer because of that. So here's your good word of the day, alluvial, and I'm glad you were able to find some alluvial soil to use because I would imagine it would work like a charm. So glad to hear that. That's one of those things. There are many areas that are much better than Colorado for being able to get supplies, gardening supplies. And so, back to the idea of organic gardening and what you can use in your garden. I like to make as much as I can. So I'll make my own mulches, I'll make my own compost, I make my own potting soils, and I'm limited in what I can buy, which is why I like to make as much as possible. And so in the past, I've bought peat moss or the cocoa core to use in my potting mixes. This year, I made the leaf mold, and so I'm going to be using the leaf mold as a replacement for that. But when it comes to something like alluvial soil, I have little doubt that I could walk into any nursery in town, definitely the big box stores, and ask if they know where I could find a source for alluvial soil, and they would have no idea what I was talking about. And that's one of the things when it comes to those of us that are serious about gardening, is a lot of times the people that are selling us the supplies don't even know what they're selling. And so you really need to know what it is you want and how you're going to use it, and you may find out that you can make it yourself or find an alternative so that you don't have to rely on someone else's advice that might be bad. There's a tree farm near me that I went to years ago, and I was looking for some very specific types of bushes, and I'd done some research and I couldn't find the specific shrubs and bushes that I was looking for. And this was at my last house, had a big deer problem. And so I was looking for deer resistant shrubs. So I went to this tree farm, one of the biggest in the area, was talking to one of the people that were working there and asked if they had a section or recommendations for deer resistant shrubs. And this worker then proceeded to lecture me on there's no such thing as a deer resistant plant. And so then I had to come back to her and say, well, yes, there is. There's no such thing as a deer-proof plant, because deer will eat anything if they're hungry enough. But there are deer-resistant varieties, the type of plants that deer don't prefer and that they'll walk by when they see it. If they're hungry enough, they'll eat it. But she was adamant that there's no such thing as a deer-resistant plant, and that she had worked at this tree nursery for 8 years, and that's what they were taught. And then I tried to be nice and let her know that Rutgers University in New Jersey has a pretty extensive list of the plants that are graded by how deer-resistant they are. And so if you're wondering about growing deer-resistant plants, look up, just do a search of Rutgers deer plants or Rutgers deer-resistant plants, and it's a great list. And I've used it often in the years since. She refused to even acknowledge that was a possibility. So I tell that long story because of the idea that you can go to people that you would suspect know what they're talking about, and they don't always know what they're talking about, which is why I think it's inherent in most of us to learn what works in our own garden and do our own research and compare sources and then come up with the information that's best for us. And this all ties back to the organic gardening. What works best for me as far as using the compost or the leaf mold may not be the best choice for you. You might have, especially if you're in an area of the world that coco coir is readily available, then that might be a better alternative for you. So I've been corresponding with a couple people in different areas of the world, and they have some concerns because they don't have the same leafy material that I have. So when I talk about leaves as a mulch or making a leaf mold, they're asking questions because they live in an environment that's very grassy and very dry, and they don't have a lot of leaves to make leaf mold. Well, that's one of those things where you have to figure out the concept, the reason that you're making it, and then modify it. So the reason I make leaf mold is because I have a lot of leaves in autumn. They break down and create a material that is organic, no chemicals involved. I made it myself, and I can add that to my soil as an organic amendment. There are lots of alternatives. If you don't have leaves, you can do the same thing with a brush pile or with a big stack of the grasses that you might have cut. You can still accomplish the same thing with some type of organic material. In this case, when I say organic, I mean something that was growing, that was alive at one point, and then you cut it down and put it in a pile so it decomposes into a much lighter material that you can work into your soil. Leaf mold's easy because a lot of us in the Northern Hemisphere have a lot of leaves. But the same idea can be done with wood chips. And I actually have a big wood chip pile now, and I'm going to dig into it this next summer. Expect to see a video on it, and to show that even a big pile of wood chips will decompose into essentially the equivalent of what would be leaf mold. It's just the decomposed material that you can then add into your garden. And so buying organic material, either organic meaning it used to be alive as a plant, or organic meaning it was certified because the producer went through the government to get that certification, buying is definitely an option. And if you want to garden organically and only use those organic materials, then definitely do that. But also start thinking about the possibility for how maybe you can figure out how to do it without buying it, and you can figure out a way to make it all yourself. So that's the approach I like to take. And so Gardens Happen says, I guess technically what we think of as grass is a leaf. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, grass is made up of leaves. We just don't think of it as a leaf, but it's the same basic idea. If you take a pile of dried grass clippings and allow it to decompose and break down, it's not much different than if you took a pile of elm tree leaves and allowed it to break down. The consistency will be different, and the amount of time it takes to break down will be different, but the basic concept is definitely the same. So, okay, let's see what we have. I'll get back to the comments and the questions and see if there's something else that we can talk about. So Jim's Garden of Eden, I use kaolin clay, which I worried my plants weren't getting enough photosynthesis. Have you used it? I haven't, but I actually have I thought about it. So I've been doing more research on the kaolin clay this year, and that's one of the issues that I've seen is when you use it, you have to make sure you're using it in the right proportions, because you can block the photosynthesis. And it depends on what kind of pests you might have that you're trying to deal with, that you would be using it in the first place. And so my preferred approach is to grow all those native grasses and all those perennial flowers and all of those herbs to attract the predatory insects that deal with the insects that I might need to use the kaolin clay or the neem oil or diatomaceous earth. All of those organic control methods are suitable for very specific pests. And my preferred method is to try to use the natural pests to deal with those. So I haven't used it, but I'm glad you asked that question, because I actually have added it to my list of potential videos in the future to do a video where I talk about diatomaceous earth and neem oil and the kaolin clay and a lot of those other methods of an organic way to deal with some of the things you've got happening in your garden and what you can do about it. And there are some that I haven't done. I have a big bag of diatomaceous earth. I don't use it very much at all. I've got a big bottle of neem oil. I haven't used it since January or February when I was starting some of my seeds, and I sprayed it just to deal with some of the little insect pests that I had that were affecting my seedlings. So they're not things I use on a regular basis, but I'm definitely going to add that one to see how it works and to see what my thoughts are. So no specific experience so far, but it's definitely one of those things that I want to do. And so, and I say this all the time to you all, always look for new things, always try new things. If there's something that you hear about and you don't know what it is, look into it. And if it's something that might fit into your bag of tricks, try it. And it may work great, might not work at all. But that's one reason, after 30 years plus of gardening, why I can speak to so many of these different topics, because I'm just curious. And I try new things all the time. And some of them work and some of them don't. Most of them I just chalk up to experience and learned information and then move on to whatever that new thing happens to be. And so try not to stay in the same place all the time with your gardening. Do try to keep moving forward with the ideas of what you have and what you're going to be doing. And that can benefit you, I think, in the long run, because I work hard gardening. That's probably no surprise to you. You all work hard gardening, but I'm trying to work towards that point where gardening isn't as much work, because of all these things I've tried that I've been able to make it easier along the way. So pest control is one of those kind of things. For me right now, it's as easy as possible. I do almost nothing. And if pests come to my plants, I always figure there's something that's going to find that plant soon after, and the pests are going to be gone. I really had no pest issues this last year. Part of it, I think, was the weird weather, but part of it is because I now have the herbs and the native plants and the flowers and all those other things that are growing. I let my weeds go crazy this year. And so I had a big weed problem, but I didn't have a pest problem. And I think that's because a lot of my native weeds are attracting those native predators that then attack the pests. So that's my preferred organic method of pest control. And it tends to work out. PT Mana planted garlic a month ago, last year's big cloves, and they sprouted in a week. Wow. Sprouts are 6 inches tall. I'll cover with leaves, but should I expect them to recover? Yeah, they should recover. Garlic is an extremely hardy plant. I think my video that I did last year, or the complete tutorial of garlic growing, I think I have some scenes in there of the garlic growing through snow in early spring. The frigid conditions, the frozen soil, and even snow are not enough to kill the garlic plant. The issue is more that, like most bulbs, and like we were talking earlier with the tulips and the bulbs that are growing now in some places in Europe because of the weird weather, the bulb has a finite amount of energy. And that energy in the bulb is going into growing the plant. And then once the plant grows, it can then replenish that energy and help the bulb grow bigger. And so that's what happens with the garlic, is we start with a clove, and there's enough energy in that clove to get the plant growing. And then once the plant starts growing through photosynthesis, it then sends energy back, and that clove turns into a bulb, and we harvest our garlic bulbs. Well, if you start with a clove and it sprouts too early and the plant starts growing, it's expended a pretty good amount of energy to grow that plant. And depending on how harsh your winter is, some of those garlic leaves are probably going to die, or at least be damaged in the cold. And so now when spring comes along, the plant is still in, got to grow, got to get that photosynthesis, got to make my propagation happen. And so it sends more energy up into the plant, but it doesn't have as much energy as it did. So the subsequent plant in the spring may not be as big. It might not have as effective photosynthesis, which means the bulb that develops is probably going to be smaller. It should still develop. You should still have plants. Just don't be surprised that the big cloves that you got this year aren't necessarily going to repeat next year. And so good luck with that. But covering them with mulch and trying to help keep the damage off of those leaves is definitely a good approach, especially if you get some really, really cold temperatures quickly before the plant can go dormant. You need to help protect the garlic as much as possible. But you're not alone. I've had dozens and dozens of people who have asked me this same question because they've got garlic sprouting when it's not supposed to be. Like I said earlier, I was concerned. I was afraid my garlic was going to be sprouting because it had been so warm. And for me, things changed almost overnight. If they had sprouted, these cold temperatures might have caused some damage on the young leaves. Once they get it growing and then they're established, the garlic can grow in the snow. It really is not that big of a problem, but it is something you do have to be careful about. Before I forget, I did want to say a thank you to Liz at the Mixing Bowl. Last week, just as I was signing off, Liz at the Mixing Bowl had sent me a super sticker donation, and I usually try to make a point to acknowledge those and thank you. And so, Liz at the Mixing Bowl, maybe you're on today. I just want to say thank you for that super sticker that you sent last week. I just didn't see it because it popped up on my screen just as I was signing off. So thank you. And of course, thank you to all the rest that send super chats and super thanks and super stickers. It's definitely appreciated. And I want to make sure you know that it's not forgotten, even if it looks like it might have been missed or forgotten in the first place. So, okay, let's see. Denise says, birds get caught in netting. I'll never use it again. There are options. I've actually had a couple people this week that have suggested, because I have a couple videos where I talk about netting. Muslin, you can take just cheap sheer material from if you are at all into going to a fabric store. If you know fabric stores, there's a lot of light fabrics that you can use in place of bird netting and still achieve the same effect. And so I know a lot of people have had problems with netting. I've had birds get caught in the netting, so what I do is I make sure I put garden staples around the edges whenever I use netting, and that really helps a lot. It keeps the netting firm to the ground and the birds can't get into it. So that makes a big difference. But yeah, other alternatives, look into fabrics rather than netting to achieve the same thing. So hello to Tony at Simplified Gardening, another wonderful member from the UK in our gardening community. Nice to see you here, Tony. And it's afternoon for Tony as well. And so I'm sure Tony will be joining in with the comments. Always has good information. Stevens, Georgia Garden. If I fill newly framed beds 2 feet by 12 feet by 8 inches deep with fresh horse manure now, we'll be ready to plant in for the upcoming spring. Probably, but I hope you're mixing it with soil. Manure by itself over the course of 4 to 5 to 6 months, if you keep it moist and if the temperature is warm, will decompose into compost effectively, because horses eat a lot of hay and that gets mixed in with the manure. And so the manure is a pretty good blend of the nitrogen and the carbon materials and will break down into compost. It all depends on how cold your winters are there in Georgia. And so I'm guessing it'll be a little bit easier for you to maintain those warmer temperatures for it to decompose. But I'm not an advocate of growing in just compost. So just decomposed manure will give a lot of the nutrients that the plants need, but there's still a structure that the soil requires. And the best way to get that soil structure is by having the native soil that you have, whether it be clay or silt or sand. You do need that as part of a good soil. And so to that, I would say add your manure, and it should benefit your soil. Another big issue, if you use nothing but organic matter to fill a bed like the manure, is that it's going to decompose. And you can expect that it will probably lose as much as 75% of its volume. So if you've got an 8-inch deep bed right now and you fill it full with manure, by the time you come to plant, you might only have 2 inches of compost that's left, because all the rest has broken down and decomposed, and you lose a lot of volume in that decomposition process. Another reason to mix it with native soil, because that helps hold the structure together and you're not going to lose that soil level. So it may be ready for planting, but Stephen, I would suggest adding some native soil to really get the benefits of filling a bed and then being able to plant in it, rather than having to come out in springtime, see how low the soil surface is, and now you've got to add more stuff, which may put you behind in your schedule for the planting. So, hey, Jay. So Jay and Heidi, our fantastic moderators, are on, of course, today. And there's Jay giving a link to Tony's book, The Composting Masterclass. And a lot of good information there about the soil as well. So thank you for that, Jay. You're always on top of things. I appreciate it. Wilbur says, hang foot-long strips of old VHS film from branches. Its shine will deter birds. That's a good idea. And I have a ton of old VHS. I've used old CDs in the past for the same thing. I'll drill a hole in the CD and then hang it from tree branches and around the garden. The problem I have with that, if you use a CD, is that outer film will actually separate over time, and all you're left with is just a clear plastic disc. But I like the idea of the VHS film. I haven't used that before, and I imagine it's going to retain its shine for a good amount of time. So good suggestion. I'll have to get out there and I've got boxes of VHS, probably like many of you of a certain age. You still have VHS film that you just can't bear to throw away. Gardens Happen saw a video testing growing in 100% organic material and trying other percentages. The one with just a little, and I think the one that was close to 50-50 did the best. Yeah, there you go. And that's, I've seen studies like that as well. And that's a big reason why I like mixing soil with the organic material to really get the best results. So thank you for sharing that. And Bohemian Herbology says, we always plug Tony's book because it's a complete guide to composting. My piles used to sit, now they break down, and I add and add and add. So that's good. Yeah, Tony's book really is a good book, and you've heard me talk about it a lot if you're a regular viewer, and it is, I am repeating myself, but it is one of those things that it's good information. Joy of the Garden. Anyone know if rutabaga will overwinter okay? They are mature, just hoping to keep them outside as I harvest. Absolutely. In fact, rutabagas, like most of the root vegetables that we grow, are biennial plants, and so they will overwinter just fine. The issue you run into is in the spring, in their second season of life, they get into seed producing mode. And so the root will be fine over the winter. The leaves will die off. And then in the spring, as soon as the soil starts warming, it'll start growing again. But like we were talking about with the bulbs, it's using the root energy to produce the plant in the second season. And so if you harvest the rutabagas next year in spring or summer, they're not going to taste the same. They're going to be really woody, and you're going to have missed out on the benefits of growing rutabagas. So if you overwinter them, then the main reason for doing that is for seed collection, because they'll grow plants, they'll send up the flower stalks, set the seed, and then you'll have rutabaga seeds for potentially years ahead. But it's one of those things that if you are leaving them in the ground for the intent of an alternate storage method, which is a great idea. You can do this with beetroots and carrots and rutabagas and parsnips. You can keep them in the ground for a long period of time. And depending on how cold your winters are, just go out and harvest when you're ready to harvest. And then as long as you're doing that before that spring growth spurt, you'll probably have some pretty good and tasty root crops. The thing to be aware of, though, is at some point, I did this with beets last year, with the idea being that I like to have roasted beets for my Christmas dinner, and went out to harvest some of those beets in December, and the ground was frozen solid around them. So I had just waited too long, and I had to hack away at the soil to get to the beets that were also frozen. And then when I did harvest a few and bring them in and they thawed out, the texture wasn't the same as they thawed, because they had been frozen and then thawed out, and it just wasn't the same. So yes, you can definitely overwinter them, but it really depends on the reason you're doing it. And if it's for harvest, then try to harvest them before the ground freezes. And the nice thing about most of these root vegetables is they'll store for months and months. If you can put them in a nice, cool, dark location, they'll store for a long time. So you may not need to leave them in the ground as long as you think you might need to. So, okay, let's see. I agree with Gardens Happen. Shiny objects don't deter birds for long. They get used to them rather quickly. So when I was using my CDs, I would put them on a post, a metal post, that I could move around the garden. And like most of the things we use to deter the animals, the deer sprays and the gopher vibrations and all those kind of things, they get used to them. And so you have to move it around. So the shiny objects can work. You just have to make it part of your daily activities to move them into new locations. And even then, after a while, they'll tend to get used to them a little bit. Yankee Sister, nice to see you as always on a Monday. Taco Promotions asked if double layering 6 mil on tropical plants add extra warmth, and would you perceive it to be effective? Yes, so actually Colorado State University did some studies. Wow, it's been probably only 30 years ago now. It was almost 20 years ago that I was in the Master Gardener program. Maybe they did these studies 25 years ago. And one of our instructors in the Master Gardener program was one of the Colorado State University department heads who had done the studies on plastic and protecting plants. And it does depend on the plastic. 6 mil plastic is what I use, and I think it's the 6 mil plastic they use in their testing. And a single layer of 6 mil plastic gave the equivalent of about 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit of protection. That's up to about 2 degrees Celsius, 2 to 2.5 degrees of protection Celsius, with just a single layer of plastic. Using a second layer of plastic with just a small airspace in between could double and potentially even triple that protection. So most of the studies showed double protection. So double plastic, double protection. But the key was that there was some air in between the layers of plastic, and that air is really what added the extra insulation. So using double plastic, so 6 mil plus 6 mil, but without that air gap, would basically make a thicker plastic, but it would only improve it by a couple degrees. You wouldn't get the dramatic improvement that you would if you could construct it with an air gap. And so I think it's 1 Yard Revolution. So 1 Yard Revolution is a channel that I really like, and he stopped making videos 3 or 4 years ago now, I think. But there's still some really good information there. And as I remember, in one of his videos, he shows his hoop house, and in the hoop house he uses a double layer protection on his plants, and it's extremely cold outside, and he's still growing actively in the greenhouse because he has a double plastic layer over the plants. So it can be effective. You just have to construct it well enough so that you can get that warm air and that air insulation to benefit it. And if you want to go to that much effort, it's definitely worth it. Now, like talking about the temperatures that I've got coming up and how cold it is for me right now, if I could gain 10 degrees Fahrenheit of protection on my plants, then that makes a big difference in autumn and early spring. But at some point, even that much protection is not going to be enough if you're in a severely cold region. And so my overnight temperature coming up on Friday is supposed to be 5 degrees Fahrenheit. That's minus 15. So if I had 5-degree temperature and I was able to add 10 degrees of protection over my plants, I'm still sitting at 15 degrees Fahrenheit, which is so cold, nothing's going to be growing. So that's one of those issues that I always add to the decision is, will it make that big a difference? It will be effective, but is it effective enough? If you're in zone 7 or zone 8 or zone 9 even, and you're going to get some of those temperatures that are going to dip down at or below freezing overnight, then a double layer of plastic may be all you need to keep those plants actively growing until the temperatures warm up again. So hope that helps, Yankee Sista. It's one of those things that I do it, and you've seen, or I have videos, I should say, that show how I use the plastic in my garden, but it only gains me a few weeks in fall and a few weeks in spring until the temperatures just get too cold that it doesn't help. But, you know, back to Eli and Kate's greenhouse in Scotland, that protection of the greenhouse or of a double plastic layer might be all you need because you don't have the severely cold winters like I do. And so look into it. That extra protection may give you a huge advantage in some of the things you can do. And yeah, James Prigioni on his channel also has that 2-layer hinged hoop house. And he's done some good things with his hinged covers. And so using the PVC and putting the different layers of plastic like James does is definitely an option to give you some of that benefit that we're looking for. Peggy, should I pull in my potted roses and strawberries since this cold train is headed our way? So strawberries are very durable. So if your strawberries are still actively growing and you're still harvesting, then I would say yes, bring them in. But if it's getting close to that change of season for you where it's going to get cold and stay cold and your strawberries are no longer actively producing, then you might want to leave your strawberries out and let the cold start sending them into dormancy. The roses, a lot of it depends on what kind of roses you have in your pots. Often the roses we grow in containers are not as hardy and do need some protection in the winter. So it depends. You'd have to look at the varieties you're growing to see if they can handle the cold temperatures or if they need that protection. But strawberries generally are durable enough that they can be exposed to the cold and it's not going to cause death or severe damage. It'll just send them into dormancy. My 5B garden with the strawberries, they're done. They're not producing anymore, but I've done nothing special for them. I never do. And every year they come back because they're a hardy plant that can handle that cold and they're used to the dormancy. That's all part of their normal cycle. But roses, like if it's a teacup rose that tend to be a little more fragile, you might want to consider bringing them in if it's not too much trouble, because better safe than sorry. It's better to bring a plant in and think, oh man, that was a lot of work, than to leave it out and lose it. And I've lost many plants in many containers over the years because I thought, I'll just leave it out and see what happens, and then it ends up getting so cold that it actually damages the plant. So do be careful of that. I do want to point out the background today. And so I think, and again, I'm repeating myself, I say this all the time, but I think everyone's garden has something to teach us. The thing that we as gardeners need to develop is the ability to learn from other people's gardens. And sometimes it takes a little bit more than just looking at it to figure out what it is we can learn from it. And so this is one of those things that I picked up on that I want to point out to you today. This garden comes from Danielle Broderick, and there's a couple things. And so this is why I say the more you have the gardening experience and the more you try to find the lessons, the more you can figure out that a gardener is doing something that's really a good idea, and maybe you can copy it or learn from it. So as you look at her garden, look at the shadow right here. And so that tells me that the sun is coming from where the camera was, and the shade runs in this direction. And so the bottom of the screen would be south, the top of the screen would be north. And so look at the orientation of the beds. All of these beds are lined up with a north to south orientation. And that's what I recommend. That's what many of us in the Northern Hemisphere in particular are recommending, the north to south orientation of the beds. So obviously some thought went into this. I love that. And this is one of those things that you just look at and go, oh, she's got a bunch of beds lined up, but they're lined up with a very specific pattern, the north to south. But what I really like is, you see these grow bags. These are the cloth grow bags, but they're elevated. And as I look at this area, I'm not exactly sure where she is, but I'm guessing it's an area that gets a lot of rain and gets really soggy. And especially as I look at these trees, my son lives in Louisiana, and there are months out of the year where the ground is just soggy all the time. Well, if you had your grow bags resting on the soil and all of this soil is saturated, then your grow bags are going to be saturated. But by elevating the grow bags on a pallet or some little structure that you might make, you've now kept your grow bags away from the soggy soil, which gives you control over the soil moisture and what the plants are getting. So I love this. This is something that if I've seen before, I haven't recognized, but now I see it and I just think it's a wonderful idea. I love raised beds, and so like the metal raised bed, I'm doing more and more of these metal raised beds. And one of the benefits of raised beds in a soggy area is that they drain better. And so if you live in a swampy area, like Lie in My Garden is saying, my garden is a swamp, everything is in raised beds. That's what I advocate, is raised beds in a swampy area. Well, look at this as an alternative. If you don't want to buy the metal raised beds, you don't want to build raised beds, just get some pallets and stick your containers on top of the pallets, and now you essentially have created a raised bed. The benefit of the good drainage and keeping dry in a soggy area is there. So absolutely love that. I wanted to make sure I pointed it out. Of course, we've got the trellis. Always nice to see a trellis. Got the vining plants down here. Nice little greenhouse setup in the back. That's always nice. So a simple garden, but this is one of those things that it has lessons to teach, even when it's a simple garden. So glad that I could show that today. Looks like I disrupted my green screen a little bit with the lighting, so we'll see if we can improve, get rid of some of that. There we go. So that might have been a little distracting for the background, but look at this garden. You might see some things that I'm missing. It might give you some ideas, but every week when I show backgrounds from different gardeners, I do try to point out some of the things that I see, and those are a couple of things I see. So thank you to Danielle for sharing that. If you'd like me to have your garden as a backdrop, go ahead and send it to me at gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com and give me permission to use it. I still am getting pictures from some of you, and I appreciate all the pictures I get, but unless they specifically say that I am given permission to use your picture, I'm not going to use it on the Monday live stream. And so I've got some good pictures that were sent that just didn't give me permission to use them. So I figure you're just sharing your garden with me, and I'll usually let you know that I like seeing your garden pictures, but I won't show it on Mondays unless you send it to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com and then give me permission to use it. So I've got a few more in the queue. I'm looking for those pictures that are going to be the seasons changing in your garden, and I've got some of those coming up in the weeks ahead, but always looking for those kind of pictures as well. It doesn't always have to be green and growing. We can learn from the gardens that are brown and dying as well because of the seasonal change. So, okay, let's see. Yeah, sunset gazing. It did look like whiteflies in the corner. I didn't have a problem with whiteflies this year. We had a couple years ago had a big whitefly problem here, but I'm sorry that you had the whitefly problem. And yes, those weren't whiteflies on the screen. So, okay, Carolyn is wondering, what do you think of planting potatoes this time of year? So it depends. It depends on where you live and what you can, what your season looks like over the course of the next 3 months or so that the potatoes are going to be growing. So if you live in the Colorado mountains, it's a terrible idea to be planting potatoes right now. The ground is going to be frozen and they're not going to do much good for growing potatoes right now. However, any potatoes you put in the ground right now in Colorado are probably going to sprout in spring. So they can overwinter often without too much damage. If you live in Arizona or New Mexico or Florida, now's probably a good time to start thinking about growing your potatoes because the temperatures are cooler and you're not going to have the hot temperatures of summer that might disrupt your potato growing. So it all depends on where you're growing. And I think for most of us in the United States and even most of us in Europe right now, it's past potato growing time. But if you're in the South and you have the warm temperatures and you're starting your winter garden, then yeah, consider growing potatoes, and consider growing potatoes in containers. And check out Tony's Simplified Gardening channel. And I've got a few videos on growing potatoes in containers as well. Very effective method for growing potatoes. And even if you're in a region where it's not quite right to grow potatoes yet, you might be able to get by with some container growing if the temperatures are going to be warming soon. So take a look at a couple of those videos, Kaolin, but it really comes down to where you are and your choice of potatoes that you want to be growing. So Gardens Happen's been thinking about growing potatoes. I think potatoes are one of those things that are really a good idea if you've got the space to grow them. And so I have one video where I talk about crops not to grow. And so if you are in an area with, or if you have a very small garden area and you don't have a lot of experience, potatoes are not high on my list of things to grow. Because if you have only got a couple beds, I think you get more bang for the buck by growing expensive crops and things like organic heirloom tomatoes and your organic heirloom peppers and the herbs that cost a fortune if you buy them from the store. If you have a small space and you're just getting started with gardening, those are the kind of plants I recommend, because at least here in the States, potatoes are pretty cheap. And so it takes a good amount of space to grow potatoes. And I think that space can be used better by other plants in a small space. I have another video where I talk about the best crops to grow if you're growing your own food. Potatoes are very high on that list because as food crops go, potatoes are among the best. And this is where container gardening comes in. So if you have a bigger garden, I say grow potatoes. If you have a small garden even, but you've got space to have containers with plants, then grow potatoes in containers. It's one of those things that, like most of the things we grow, the potatoes we grow taste better than the potatoes that you buy from the store. But they do take up a lot of space and they're cheap to buy. So I think buying the expensive crops are a better way for you to fit budgeting in with your gardening. Totally up to you, but absolutely try some potatoes, and I bet you'll definitely find some benefits. And like Urban Chicken Mama says, they grew using Tony's method in the grow bags, and they turned out well. So I think it's a great thing that you should consider trying and adding to your gardening repertoire if you haven't done it yet. And so John C. did the same thing, grew potatoes in containers after watching Tony and was able to grow them on the patio edges. So used no garden spaces. Oh, there you go. Great idea. Great minds think a lot. I'm glad you did that, John. And so I think I mentioned a few weeks back, the potatoes I grew this year were the leftover potatoes that came from the grow bags the year before. So last year, I grew a whole bunch of potatoes in grow bags, harvested them, and then used that grow bag soil in my greenhouse when I got my greenhouse set up. Well, some of those little itty bitty potatoes that I didn't even see overwintered, sprouted, and grew potatoes in my greenhouse this year. And that's why I say you can plant potatoes now wherever you are. And it just might mean that they're overwintering in frozen soil, but they'll sprout and grow into potatoes in most cases in come springtime. So just something to think about as an option. Deborah Jones used 5-gallon buckets. Yep, easy to harvest. That's one of the nice things about containers with potatoes is that they are extremely easy to harvest. So Ty Lily have been following you, but my first live. Well, glad you're here today for your first live. Always nice to have people here, and we do this every Monday, and 90 minutes of gardening talk and sharing information with wonderful gardeners from around the world. What can be better than that? I will say, just to let you know today, and I'll talk more about it next week, but I will not have a live stream in 2 weeks. So I'm actually going to be doing some traveling over the Thanksgiving holiday, and I'll be traveling on that Monday. And so we won't have a live stream 2 weeks from now. But I'll remind you next week that we all get a vacation, so to speak, from the Monday live stream. But then I'll be coming back and do it all over again. So hope to see you here again, Tay, I'm not sure how you might pronounce that, but hope to see you again on Mondays in the future, because that's what I do on my Monday mornings. And I know some of you are in your Monday evenings, but it's just a good chance to get together. So, car accident, like the weather station video. Thank you. I live between 2 airports and it's hard to get good weather data for me. 1010. Thank you so much. Yeah, I did the weather station video this last week, and it's interesting because I'm already seeing that it is a little bit different, a degree or two different from the weather station, the National Weather Service station that I have near me. And so it's given me some pretty good accurate readings. For instance, I know it's been cold. And as I mentioned in that video about the weather and tracking it in your garden, knowing when you get the lows and when you get the highs and those patterns in your garden can really give you a step up, particularly if you're trying to protect your plants with plastic and you're trying to get a little bit longer growing season. Knowing when the coldest temperatures come and knowing when the weather changes can really be a benefit. And so just as an example, I think it was Thursday this last week, we had a cold day. The high temperature for the day was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That's minus 2 degrees Celsius. And that occurred for me at 2:50 in the afternoon. And so as I am now starting to look at my trends in this cold weather that we're having here in Colorado, I'm seeing that my high temperature for the day is between 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That may be beneficial information. It might not. It might be just a gee whiz part of the weather analysis. But now I can start tracking my high temperature of the day. And I'll continue to do that to see when we get into summer, is it about the same time of day? And that might influence what I do with my gardening activities when I get outside. Right now, it tells me that I don't go outside in the morning to work in the garden and help clean things up. I do it in the afternoon because that's when it's going to be the warmest. It's complete opposite in the summer. So one reason why I have my weather station right now. And I'm glad you liked that video because I've been enjoying the data that I've been getting so far, and it really has been beneficial, and looking forward to more. And the nice thing about the weather station I got that I show in the video, it's part of a network. And there are 5 or 6 other weather stations very close to me, home weather stations. And so I've been using that to calibrate some of my information. So I can see what the temperatures are like in my garden and compare them with the gardening or the weather information, I'm guessing other gardens, but near me. And I've noticed in the morning that my temperature readings are a couple degrees higher than everybody else around me. It could be the way I've mounted my station. I might be more accurate. They might be more accurate. But it's leading me to believe that for a few hours in the morning, I'm not quite as warm as I think I am. And I don't know if that's going to influence anything, but it's fun just to see what's happening with the weather in the garden and get an idea of how I compare, so to speak, with other people in the area. And I think it's that comparison that is often important. I'll talk more about that in just a little bit as we compare ourselves with the others. So Sonia, it's so late. Don't worry about being late. Turning compost piles is a nice Monday activity, and you can always catch up with what we've been talking about in replay or just rewind and start at the beginning. The idea today was on the organic gardening. And so turning the compost pile, I say, Sonia, just by doing that is an organic gardener. You know, there are some of these activities that we have in our garden that just by doing that activity, is kind of a clue for how we approach gardening. I know that there are gardeners who make their own compost and then also use synthetic herbicides and pesticides. But I think more of us, when we learn about composting and the benefits that it gives to the soil, and Tony talks about this in his book, how the synthetic chemicals in the soil really cause damage. Once you get into composting and you do more of the learning, you recognize that the synthetic chemicals just aren't good in your garden, and you become an organic gardener. Or if you don't want to call yourself an organic gardener, you can recognize that you are gardening organically. It doesn't have to be 100%. You don't have to do everything organically. It's up to your individual philosophy in your individual garden to determine how you approach it. Like I said, at the Galileo garden, we were 100%. Everything was organic. No synthetic chemicals of any type, beyond organic. I'll be honest, I've got a video I did a couple years ago where I talked about weed control. I have some areas of my garden, not my garden, I take it back. I don't use chemicals in my garden, but I have some areas of my landscape that weeds come into the rock, and there's just no way to deal with that in an effective method without using some synthetic chemicals. So I have used chemicals in some areas of my landscape in the past. That means I'm not 100%. But you know what? I'm an organic gardener. I garden organically. So don't feel like it's an all or nothing kind of thing. And by all means, don't feel guilty if you are using some of those things that some others might not consider organic. It doesn't really matter. It's your garden. Do it however you want to do it. I just think it's one of those things that if we can do the things that give us that good feeling of organic gardening, if we can reuse materials in our garden, that's a big aspect. I try not to buy new stuff. I use old stuff and reuse what I have. That's part of the organic gardening philosophy that I have. I stay away from the chemicals. I use my own natural mulches and compost and leaf mold. That's part of my choice for organic gardening. When it comes to the birds and the other pests, I'll just cover the plants, or I use those beneficials to come in and help me out along the way. So you can start figuring this out on your own. And that's why I wanted to do this video today as we move into these cold winter months for many of us. This is one of those topics that I think is really a good idea for you to think about. I think winter is a great time of year to start identifying what your gardening philosophy is and what you're going to do to promote your individual philosophy in your garden for the next growing season. And organic gardening is one of those things that if you've never thought of yourself as an organic gardener, or you thought you wanted to become an organic gardener, use the next few months to figure it out and figure out what kind of approach you want to take as you move forward in the journey to become an organic gardener. And the ideas that I've thrown out today may help guide you a little bit, but think about it. One way or the other, you don't have to be an organic gardener by any stretch. But if it's something you're thinking about, then think about it and learn more about it and start figuring out what direction you want to head into. Yankee Sista Homestead, thank you for that super chat. Always nice to see you. Another great live in the books. Gardener Scott, have a blessed week. You have a blessed week as well. Thank you so much for that. And as I scroll down, Rick says vinegar may be an alternative to weeds in the rocks. The thing about the vinegar, it depends on the weed. And I've tried vinegar on weeds. I actually started filming a video and never released the video. The vinegar creates a highly acidic environment, which is enough to kill most leaves of weeds. Depending on the weed, it's not enough to kill the root. And that's the key difference. And why I am not using an organic method like vinegar with some of the weeds I have, because some of the weeds I have are pernicious weeds, and vinegar will kill the leaves and then they pop right back up again. And because they're in rocks, I can't get down and pull out or dig out the roots. So you are right, Rick, in that for many of the broadleaf weeds that we have, vinegar is enough to kill the weeds, and if they got a shallow root system, that's often enough to kill the plant. But those deep-rooted weeds, vinegar just usually doesn't work as much as it really should. And Sunset Gazing says that agricultural vinegar is a higher strength. Yeah, typically the vinegar we have in our home is about 5%, and you can get the higher vinegar. I actually haven't tried the agricultural vinegar, but that's a good point. Maybe I should work on it. And like Gardens Happen points out, vinegar doesn't work on grass. It's the broadleaf leaves that it is really most effective on. So sometimes, you have to do what you have to do to try to get rid of. So, yeah, Tennessee Nana's asking about Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass is one of those that even if you spray it with chemicals, it doesn't always kill it, because it spreads by the rhizomes underground, and just a little bit of the root can keep growing. Bermuda grass is one of those that spraying and digging and spraying and digging and pulling and digging, you can try covering it with a clear plastic solarization and leaving that in place for months at a time. That can help, but even that is tough. So Bermuda grass is one of those that is notoriously difficult to kill, but you just got to keep after it with all of these different methods, and in time it should dissipate, and you can get it under control. It just takes a lot of work over a lot of time. So yeah, Tony says lots of weeds that are tough but persistent pays off. You just got to keep after it, keep after it, keep after it. What's in the garden is right. Boiling water is a lot like vinegar. You can kill weeds, but can take out all the life in that small area. It hits, but it's gone right away and 100% safe. Yeah, and that's another reason why, and I think I mentioned that in one of my videos about using vinegar as a weed control, is it disrupts the soil life. The boiling water will kill everything right away. It doesn't disrupt the pH like vinegar will, but it can be effective. And again, for the broadleaf weeds with the shallow roots, the boiling water can actually work. But even like with Bermuda grass, the boiling water probably isn't going to have a lot of effect on it. And so when I said I was going to be talking about this as we start comparing our gardens and we compare the things we're doing in the garden. So I have a new word for you, and I think this is one of those things that I think gardeners are humble braggers. And so if you look up humble brag, Merriam-Webster defines it as to make a seemingly modest, self-critical, or casual statement or reference that is meant to draw attention to one's admirable or impressive qualities or achievements. And I saw this and I thought that, in a good way, we gardeners do that. And I actually enjoy doing it as well. We like to brag about our gardens. We like to talk about all the things that we're growing and the successes we have. And we often preface that with something that isn't as aggressive, something that's not as boastful, where we're being humble. We start off by talking about the problems we've had, the plants that died, but, and it's always a but. It's, my garden was terrible this year, but my zucchini did great. Oh, I had a lot of trouble with pests this year eating my lettuce, but I've never had so wonderful tomatoes in my garden. And I like that about gardeners, because if all we did was boast all the time about how wonderful our gardens were, everybody would hate gardeners. And it can become quite competitive. If I'm boasting about my garden and you're boasting about your garden, it's one-upmanship from that point forward. And there's nothing that is going to benefit either of us in that conversation. But when I say to you, man, it's been so cold in my garden, I haven't been able to grow anything. But I did start growing some plants indoors in my grow tent, and they're doing great. And then that invites you to say, oh yeah, I know, this year I had a terrible time in my garden with the the birds that came in and they ate all of my apples, but I figured out a good way to put the netting over the trees, and now the birds don't bother them anymore. And so this humble bragging, I think, is really an effective way for us to share information and to teach the other person something that we've learned without being boastful and without being too competitive and too forceful. And so when you see yourself, or if you catch yourself being a humble bragger, go for it. I think that's one of the things that makes gardeners such wonderful people, is we are humble, but we also have the adversity in our garden, and we want to tell everybody about our successes. We just have to try to figure out that balance of the humility versus the boastfulness. And just know that we all are doing this. I do it all the time. And it's one of those things that I would shout to the mountaintops some of the successes that I've had. But the reason they were successes is because of those lessons I learned along the way with the dead plants and the terrible weather and the things that I just didn't know I was doing right until I figured out that I was doing it right. So I'm a gardener. I'm a humble bragger, and I think that's a wonderful thing. And I hope you can feel better about bragging about your garden as a humble bragger, because that's just what we tend to do. But go ahead and tell others about your successes. As we start having family gatherings and gatherings of friends in the weeks ahead as the holidays are approaching, brag about your garden, but be a humble bragger. Maybe highlight some of the problems you had that got you to that point that you can brag about it. And I'm going to continue to brag about the things that I accomplish. I did that a month or so ago, where the background that I normally like to have as other people's backgrounds, I had my background because I was just so proud of my garden. I had to brag about it. It's okay. It's okay to brag about your garden. It's okay to be boastful, and it's okay that you do it in a humble way that others can enjoy and learn from. Rachel, thank you so much for that super sticker. I appreciate the contribution, and I appreciate you being here, and all the support that you and everybody else, of course, offer every single week. This is just so fantastic. So, of course, we'll be back next Monday. I won't be back in 2 weeks, but we'll talk more about that next week as we do this all over again on a Monday. If you're in a cold area, stay warm. If it's going to be colder, don't go outside and stay even warmer. And if you're just starting to grow, go for it and have all the fun you can, and get ready for that humble bragging as the season approaches. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.